Donald Trump and Joe Biden are essentially neck and neck when it comes to the RCP national average, with Donald Trump ahead of Joe Biden by just 1.2%, certainly within the average polling margin of error. So in today's video, we're going to talk about how the 2024 election is shaping up at this point in time and what could potentially change over the next nearly 180 days that could influence the election one way or the other. So we're going to get to all of that, as well as looking at some of these statewide polls in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So the polls for Joe Biden overall aren't too great. He's currently losing in the national popular vote, which is something that Democrats typically win. When it comes to his job approval rating, according to RCP, he's underwater by 17 points. The direction of the country, 41% of Americans think the country's on the wrong track. And yet the election is so close between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, which I think is certainly an indictment on Donald Trump himself, because had this been a matchup between a generic Republican and Joe Biden, I think that Republican would probably be leading Joe Biden by high single digits nationally, even despite how partisan our politics tend to be nowadays. I think a sort of generic Republican, I think, would be able to harness a lot of the anti-Biden independent vote and be palatable enough to those voters in order to win. But of course, now we're in a situation where things are basically a dead heat. And this was sort of the rematch a lot of Americans were dreading. You know, we looked at polls months and months ago that over 70% of Americans didn't want a Trump-Biden matchup. But nonetheless, this is what the American people are stuck with. And it's pretty obvious now, whoever the winner of the 2024 election is, they're probably going to be either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. So, you know, taking a look at the civics numbers, I think Biden's numbers are even worse. He's underwater by 22 points. If we go through the demographics of his approval nationally, if we take a look at age groups, the worst approval rating for Joe Biden is among 18 to 34-year-olds, which is very interesting because this is a typically very liberal demographic, and we'll probably make a video at some point in the future about young voting patterns in America, because I think it is pretty alarming for the GOP how democratic the young vote is. But the caveat to that is that young voters don't turn out in the numbers that older voters turn out, and as a result, you have much closer elections in the country. You know, if young voters were coming out proportionally at the same rate as the plus 65 group or the 50 to 64, you would see elections much more in the Democratic direction. But the fact that the base of support that should be the strongest for Joe Biden, young voters, is his worst demographic is pretty alarming for Democrats, because they need young voters to turn out if they're going to beat Donald Trump a second time. Sort of the older millennials, younger Gen X voters, which I don't even know if 35 is considered older millennial at this point. It might be somewhere in the middle. But, you know, 56, 35, that's still terrible numbers overall. You go by college graduates, for instance. Obviously, non-college graduates, you're going to see Biden have the worst approval rating. He has the highest approval rating with post-grads, which are also one of the most democratic voting groups when it comes to educational attainment. You know, male and female. Females disapprove of Joe Biden by only 11 points. Males disapprove of him 64-30. Nothing really surprising about that. Males are much more conservative than females. Perhaps that could be the topic of another video, because that's a really interesting phenomenon, especially when you look at Gen Z. Gen Z men in particular are much more conservative than Gen Z women. So that's a whole interesting situation. But, you know, obviously with Republicans, Joe Biden is underwater 96-2. And then even with independents, 66 to 23% of independents disapprove of Joe Biden. And yet, despite all of these numbers, Joe Biden is still basically tied with Donald Trump nationally, which, again, I'm showing you these stats to sort of illustrate how dead on arrival Joe Biden would be if he was up against another opponent. Doesn't have to be, you know, it couldn't even be one of the opponents running, for instance, just any other generic Republican, because I think there's a number of the candidates that were running in the primary, DeSantis, for instance, that had their own problems with the general electorate. Similar problems that Donald Trump has, you know, race again. White voters disapprove of Joe Biden the highest. Latino voters disapprove of Joe Biden by 9 points, which, again, that's a solid Democratic voting group. African American, the most solid demographic voting group for Joe Biden. 64% approve of Biden, 22% disapprove. You know, that really doesn't mean all that much, because I think there's going to be a significant amount of people that disapprove of Joe Biden and still end up voting for him in the election. So, you know, this was sort of the situation we saw in the midterms as well, where Joe Biden was underwater by a pretty significant amount. If we go back to Election Day 2022, Joe Biden was underwater essentially by 12 points, 13 points on Election Day during the midterms, and yet Democrats ended up coming out essentially stronger. They picked up a seat in the Senate. You had Republicans narrowly win back the House, so it was essentially a purple election year overall. Democrats made some gains, Republicans made some gains, and that was all while Joe Biden was very unpopular nationally. Now, of course, Joe Biden's underwater by 22 points, and, Democrats are still basically neck and neck with Republicans. So this goes to show you again that voters aren't necessarily voting for the candidate they like. They're voting over party and ideological agreement. Now, I think one of the reasons Joe Biden's so unpopular with younger voters is obviously the whole conflict you have in the Middle East with Israel and Palestine. There's obviously a lot of voters who disagree with Joe Biden's handling of that, especially when it comes to aid to Israel. So, there is sort of a backlash among young voters. Also, you have a backlash among young progressives who think, Joe Biden hasn't gone far enough on other issues when it comes to domestic policy. So, having your key constituents disenfranchised by your candidacy is certainly not a recipe for success. But again, Joe Biden is very lucky to go up against Donald Trump, because if he was going up against somebody else, I think this race would already be over with. Now, this is my election map. This is basically the way I see the election turning out as of today. The 3 states that are in the toss-up category, I think could go either way. Georgia, Wisconsin, Nevada are basically 50-50 for either candidate. Donald Trump leads in all of these states, but I think when you account for their political leanings and historical trends, I think it really is a complete toss-up how these states go. I think if you had to push me, Arizona narrowly goes to Joe Biden, which would put him at 271. But if we take Arizona out of the toss-up column, Joe Biden's at 260, Donald Trump's at 235. Now, I really find it hard to believe Joe Biden getting under 260 electoral votes, mainly because I think Pennsylvania is going to go blue and Michigan is going to go blue. So Donald Trump would essentially need to win Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada in order to win the election. And he could lose Nevada, but he needs to win all the other states. He needs to win Arizona. If he loses Arizona but flips Nevada, if Joe Biden is winning Pennsylvania and Michigan, it's still a done deal. Donald Trump loses the election. So, Trump really needs 2 states in the Rust Belt in order to lock in the election. And, Michigan and Pennsylvania, historically, you'd say Pennsylvania is probably a more gettable state for Donald Trump, since it's the state he won last time. I mean, he won Michigan as well, but Pennsylvania is certainly more purple than the state of Michigan is. So it's more realistic, but it's one of the states where Joe Biden is actually pulling ahead very, very narrowly at this point in time, which is one of the reasons why I think Pennsylvania probably goes Democratic. As for a couple of other reasons, I've been meaning to make a video on Pennsylvania for a while. Eventually, at some point, I will, because I think Pennsylvania is just a very difficult state for the Republicans to win overall. So I really think in order for Donald Trump to win, he needs Wisconsin, he needs Nevada or Arizona, and he certainly needs Georgia in order to lock in 270 electoral votes. Now, there's certainly a lot of things that could change from now until Election Day. Obviously, the foreign policy situation in the Middle East could certainly change. That's been a huge thorn in the side of Joe Biden ever since the war in Israel-Palestine broke out back in October of last year. And, that's been really hurting him with young voters. And in states where you have high college educational attainment, that's certainly going to be a massive issue when it comes to turnout. You need young voters to turn out in order to get Joe Biden over the finish line. Abortion is one issue I think helps Joe Biden, because states like Arizona and Nevada are going to have abortion referendums on the ballot. And obviously, if the pro-choice people can tie that to the general election, that's certainly something that could help Joe Biden, because their argument's going to be that Joe Biden could sign a law to codify Roe v. Wade into law. So, that's something I think that hurts Donald Trump. Obviously, Donald Trump is also hurt by his image, the fact that he really fails to get over 50% nationally when it comes to favorability. His favorability rating is very low. The only good thing in his regard to that is that Joe Biden's favorability is very low as well. But like I've said a number of times in this video, had Joe Biden been going up against sort of typical average Republican, this race would not be that close. I think that Republican would win fairly easily. Something Joe Biden has that Donald Trump doesn't have, obviously, is the incumbency and the fact that he's sort of the quote-unquote default option. He's not somebody who's incredibly popular, but among voters who are very wary of Donald Trump, they might opt for another 4 years of Biden than rather risk Donald Trump's promised revenge tour around the country. And that's something that I think a lot of left-wing independents and sort of just centrists in the middle might end up doing at the end of the day to put Biden over the finish line, because they're more afraid of Donald Trump than they are of Joe Biden, even though the economy has been pretty bad. his approval rating has been pretty bad, and you sort of have this international chaos going on when it comes to Ukraine, Israel, so on and so forth. So, you know, as of today, I think the election's a pure toss-up. I've said many times before that I think Joe Biden is still the favorite for a number of reasons. I think Democrats essentially have a very fundamental advantage when it comes to the Rust Belt. I think in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, as we've seen really ever since 2016, Democrats have been winning all of the key races essentially in these states, you know, barring maybe Wisconsin Senate. But, you know, Democrats in Pennsylvania and Michigan have essentially had a clean sweep since the 2016 election. And Donald Trump needs Michigan or Pennsylvania if he's going to lose any of the other states on the map. Because if Donald Trump loses, let's say, Georgia, for example, he has no path to the presidency if the Rust Belt continues to go blue. In fact, he has no path to the presidency even if he wins Georgia and the Rust Belt goes blue. His only hope is that he wins Wisconsin, which I think is the most gettable of the toss-up states in the Rust Belt, and then he'll narrowly win 278 to 260. So if Donald Trump wanted to have a buffer or a little bit of security in case Wisconsin falls to Joe Biden, he would have to win either Michigan or Pennsylvania, which would put him at 302 if he won both of those states, as well as all the other states that he won in the 2020 election, and of course flipping Georgia, Arizona, Nevada on top of that. So, you know, at the end of the day, I think Democrats have the fundamental advantage because of mail-in voting. They have an incredible early vote operation Republicans don't have. But, you know, Republicans have 180 days to get their fundraising in order to make themselves competitive against Democrats when it comes to the early vote. And, you know, that's really the key to winning a lot of these elections, because in Pennsylvania, as we're going to talk about in a future video, Democrats essentially have a massive firewall when it comes to the early vote and mail-in vote. So by the time Republicans vote on election day, they essentially just don't have the numbers to make up what Democrats have. If we take a look at Pennsylvania back in 2020, Joe Biden only won by 1.2% against Donald Trump. But if we look at the absentee early mail-in votes, Donald Trump loses to Joe Biden 78 to 21. That is a colossal margin, well over 700,000 votes. And that Democratic firewall is also what brought John Fetterman to victory in 2022. So if Republicans want any chance at winning the 2024 election, they have to address the fact that Democrats have this operation, and they need to get Republican voters who would otherwise miss election day to get out and vote early, because otherwise they really don't have a chance. But as of right now, I think Democrats have a very narrow advantage, but Republicans could certainly make use of that. And we're going to talk about a number of these states and, of course, the coinciding Senate races as we go on for the next few months before Election Day. But essentially, this is a toss-up with Joe Biden being a slight, narrow favorite. Of course, leave your comments down below. Let me know what you think. If you haven't already, like this video. Subscribe down below if you aren't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.